Deep in the remote, unforgiving timberlands of rural Oregon, a 9-year-old boy chasing a stray dog stumbled upon an absolute nightmare. Bound to a massive, rotting oak tree with heavy industrial chains was a woman battered, freezing, and wearing the unmistakable, blood-stained leather cut of a Hells Angels wife. She had been left in the deep woods to die, a brutal message in a violently escalating underground war. Most kids would have run away, screaming. Most adults would have turned a blind eye. But what this little boy did next didn't just save her life. It triggered a seismic shockwave across the country, summoning 3,000 roaring Harleys to his tiny, corrupt town. This is the unbelievable story of loyalty, a ruthless betrayal, and a child who outsmarted the criminal underworld. The dense woods bordering the Hamilton family property in Deschutes County were a place most locals instinctively avoided. The towering Douglas firs grew so thick that they choked out the afternoon sun, casting the forest floor into a perpetual, chilling twilight. For 9-year-old Leo Hamilton, however, the woods were a sanctuary. He was a quiet, observant boy who preferred the company of his golden retriever mix, Buster, to the loud, chaotic kids at his elementary school. It was a crisp Tuesday in late October. The wind carried the bitter promise of an early frost. Leo was supposed to be doing his math homework, but Buster had caught the scent of a wild rabbit and bolted past the tree line. Cursing under his breath, the way he'd heard his father do, Leo grabbed his flashlight and plunged into the brush to retrieve the dog. He hiked for nearly 2 miles, venturing further past the property line than he ever had before. The familiar sounds of the highway faded, replaced by the eerie, isolated silence of the deep timber. He finally found Buster sitting dead still at the edge of a steep, hidden ravine, letting out a low, continuous growl. "Come here, boy," Leo whispered, his voice trembling slightly. But the dog wouldn't budge. He was staring down into the hollow. Leo crept forward, peering over the edge of the embankment. At first, all he saw was shadows and dead ferns. But then, he heard it. The sharp, unmistakable clinking of heavy metal against bark. Clack, clack. It was a desperate, exhausted rhythm. Sliding down the muddy embankment, Leo clutched his flashlight tightly. As he broke through the final cluster of blackberry bushes, the beam of his light hit something that made his blood run cold. It was a woman. She was slumped against the base of a monstrous, dying oak tree. Her wrists were secured above her head with thick, rusted logging chains that wrapped around the massive trunk, locked tight with a heavy-duty industrial padlock. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised and smeared with dirt and dried blood. Over her shivering frame, she wore a heavy black leather vest. Even in the dim light, Leo could read the bold, rocker-style patches stitched onto the back, and the smaller patch on the front that read, "Property of Dutch." Leo froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew about bikers. Everyone in the county did. The local chapter of the Hells Angels ran the rougher bars on the edge of town, and their presence was a silent, heavy fact of life. You didn't look at them too long, and you definitely didn't cross them. The woman's head snapped up at the sound of Leo's boots snapping a twig. Her eyes, though swollen, were piercingly sharp. They were the eyes of a cornered predator, terrified but fiercely alive. "Who's there?" she rasped. Her voice was cracked, completely destroyed by thirst. Leo took a hesitant step backward, his instinct screaming at him to run back to the safety of his house. I was just looking for my dog," he stammered, shining the light slightly away from her face, so as not to blind her. The woman let out a dry, rattling breath. She looked at the boy, taking in his small stature, his terrified expression, and the golden retriever whining at the top of the ridge. "Kid," she whispered, her voice dropping to an urgent, desperate plea. "Kid, you have to help me. I've been out here for 2 days. I'm going to freeze to death tonight." "I'll call the police," Leo said, already turning to scramble up the hill. "My dad has a phone in the kitchen. I'll call Sheriff Boyd." "No!" she shrieked. The sudden volume of her voice startled a flock of crows into the air. The effort cost her, and she slumped violently against the chains, coughing. When she looked back up, there was absolute terror in her eyes. "No cops. Do you hear me? If you call Tom Boyd, I am dead. And if they find out you saw me, You and your family are dead too." Leo stopped dead in his tracks. The gravity in her voice wasn't a threat. It was a terrifying fact. "Who? Who did this to you?" Leo asked, his voice barely a squeak. "My name is Claire," she said, her chest heaving. "My husband is Dutch Moretti. He's a nomad. The men who did this to me, they wear the same patch. He does. They own the police in this county. If you bring the cops here, you're just handing me back to my executioners." Leo stood in the freezing mud, the weight of the adult world suddenly crashing down on his small shoulders. He was 9 years old. He didn't understand the intricacies of outlaw motorcycle club politics, corrupt sheriffs, or turf wars, but he understood one thing with absolute, undeniable clarity. If he walked away, this woman would die in the dark. "What do you need?" Leo asked. Claire closed her eyes in a brief moment of immense relief. "Tools, bolt cutters, a hacksaw, anything, and water. Kid, if you do this, I promise you, you will have an army behind you for the rest of your life. But you have to hurry." The run back to his house felt like moving through a nightmare where his legs wouldn't work fast enough. Leo burst through the back door of his rural home. The house was quiet. His father, a diesel mechanic, was working a late shift at the truck stop, and his older brother was out with friends. The isolation, which usually made Leo feel lonely, was now his greatest advantage. He moved with manic precision. From the kitchen, he grabbed 2 bottles of water, a handful of high-protein granola bars, and a thick woolen hunting blanket from the hall closet. Then, he crept into his father's locked garage. Leo knew where the spare key was hidden under an old coffee can. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust. He scanned the pegboards until he found what he needed, a massive pair of 3 6-inch industrial bolt cutters with bright yellow handles. They weighed almost as much as he did, but he dragged them off the hook, wrapping them in an old tarp to muffle the clanking metal. By the time Leo made it back to the ravine, the sun had fully dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into pitch blackness. He navigated strictly by the weak beam of his flashlight and the memory of the path. When he reached the bottom of the hollow, he found Claire shivering uncontrollably, her lips a pale, dangerous shade of blue. "Drink," Leo commanded, unscrewing a water bottle and holding it to her cracked lips. She drank greedily, choking and coughing, but swallowing the life-saving liquid. He shoved a granola bar into her hands, which were trembling so violently she could barely hold it. "Okay," Leo said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He unwrapped the heavy bolt cutters. "I brought these." Claire managed a weak, incredulous laugh. "You're a tough little bastard, aren't you?" Leo wedged the jaws of the heavy steel cutters around the thick shackle of the padlock. He squeezed the handles together, putting all of his 90 pounds of body weight into it. He pushed until his face turned purple and his arms shook, but the steel wouldn't bite. It was a hardened master lock. "It's not working," Leo gasped, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. "Don't go for the lock," Claire instructed, her voice steadying as the water and food hit her system. "Go for the weakest link in the chain. Find a rusted one." Leo ran his fingers along the freezing metal until he found a link near the back of the tree that looked heavily oxidized. He maneuvered the heavy jaws around the rusted iron, planted his feet in the mud, and threw his entire body weight onto the handles. Snop! The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent forest. The heavy chains slithered off Claire's wrists, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. She collapsed forward into the mud, crying out in pain as blood rushed back into her numb, bruised arms. Leo draped the heavy woolen blanket over her shoulders, helping her to her feet. "We can't stay here. My dad has an old root cellar behind our barn. It's completely buried. Nobody goes down there." As they slowly limped back toward the Hamilton property, avoiding the main trails, Claire began to explain the terrifying reality of their situation. "My husband Dutch is a highly respected member of the West Coast Nomads," Claire rasped, leaning heavily on the boy. "But the local chapter president here, a man named Iron Bill Lawson, has been skimming money from the National Club's operations. Dirty money, guns, extortion. He's been padding his own pockets and buying off Sheriff Boyd to look the other way." "Why did they tie you to a tree?" Leo asked, his voice hushed. "Dutch found out," Claire said, her eyes darkening. "He was auditing the books for the National Charter. Iron Bill knew that if Dutch reported back to Oakland, the National Club would greenlight him. They would wipe him and his entire corrupt chapter off the map. So, Bill struck first. He ambushed Dutch on the highway. "I don't know if my husband is dead or alive." She paused, coughing violently into the blanket. "Bill's men grabbed me from our motel. They left me in the woods to die of exposure, so there wouldn't be a bullet hole or a murder weapon. If they just found my frozen body, Sheriff Boyd would write it off as a tragic hiking accident or a drug overdose. No murder investigation, no heat from the National Club. It was the perfect cover-up." They reached the edge of the Hamilton property. The old barn loomed like a shadow against the starlit sky. Behind it, obscured by overgrown weeds and an old tractor tire, was the heavy wooden door of the storm cellar. Leo pulled it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and helped Claire down the dirt stairs into the pitch-black, musty underground room. He clicked on a battery-powered camping lantern, illuminating the dusty shelves of old mason jars and forgotten tools. "You're safe here for now," Leo said. "Leo." Claire looked at him, her expression dead serious. "If Iron Bill realizes I'm missing from that tree, he's going to tear this county apart looking for me. He knows that if I make one phone call to the right people, his life is over. I need a phone. Not a landline. Boyd will have those tapped. I need a cell phone." Leo bit his lip. "My older brother, Travis. He has a secret prepaid phone he uses to talk to his girlfriend because my dad grounded him. It's hidden in his bedroom." "Get it," Claire said. "And kid, do not let anyone see you." Sneaking into his older brother's room was vastly more terrifying to Leo than walking through the dark woods. Travis was asleep, snoring softly, a half-empty can of soda on his nightstand. Leo crawled on his hands and knees, holding his breath as he reached under Travis's mattress. His fingers brushed against cold plastic. The burner phone. He slipped it into his pocket and crawled out backwards, silently closing the door. When he returned to the cellar, Claire snatched the phone like a lifeline. Her hands were still shaking, but her focus was absolute. She didn't dial 911. She dialed an out-of-state area code. Leo watched in silence as she waited for the line to pick up. "Yeah, it's Danny," Claire said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into a cold, authoritative tone Leo hadn't heard before. Code red. "Iron Bill Lawson went rogue. He tried to disappear me into chutes. He hit Dutch on the interstate. I don't know Dutch's status." She listened for a moment. "I'm hidden. A local kid pulled me out. Listen to me very carefully. Bill has Sheriff Tom Boyd on the payroll. Do not call the local authorities. You tell the council that Iron Bill is burning the charter. Bring the thunder." She hung up, snapped the burner phone in half, and dropped the pieces onto the dirt floor. "What happens now?" Leo asked, eyes wide. "Now," Claire said, leaning her head back against the cold dirt wall, "we wait, and we pray they don't find us before the cavalry arrives." Dawn broke over the Oregon pines, but it brought no warmth. Instead, it brought the piercing wail of police sirens. Leo was sitting at the kitchen table, pushing a bowl of cereal around, when Sheriff Tom Boyd's cruiser pulled aggressively into their gravel driveway, followed closely by two unmarked black pickup trucks. The dust hadn't even settled before heavy boots were hitting the ground. Leo's father, Mark Hamilton, walked out onto the porch, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "Morning, Tom. What's all this about? Little early for a parade?" Sheriff Boyd, a hulking man with a tight jaw and cold, calculating eyes, rested his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Behind him, 4 men stepped out of the black trucks. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They were wearing heavy leather cuts. At the center was a man with a scarred face and a jagged, custom-made knife strapped to his thigh. This was Iron Bill Lawson. "Morning, Mark," Boyd said, his voice slick but carrying an undeniable edge of menace. "Got a bit of a situation. A highly dangerous individual, a woman, escaped from custody last night. We have reason to believe she might be hiding out on some of the larger properties near the forest line." "A fugitive?" Mark frowned. "We haven't seen anything." "It's just me and my boys here." Iron Bill stepped forward, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the barn. "You wouldn't mind if we took a look around, would you, Mark? Just to ensure the safety of your family." "Look around all you want," Mark said, confused but cooperative. "But I'm telling you, nobody's here." Inside the kitchen, Leo stopped breathing. He watched through the window as Iron Bill and two of his heavily tattooed enforcers walked directly toward the barn. They were methodical, checking the outbuildings, kicking over barrels. They were hunting. Suddenly, one of the bikers stopped near the edge of the woods. He bent down, picking something out of the mud. He held it up for Iron Bill to see. It was a piece of the rusted chain Leo had snapped the night before. Iron Bill's head slowly turned, his dead eyes locking onto the Hamilton family house. He knew. He knew the woman hadn't just broken a padlock with her bare hands. Someone had helped her, and whoever helped her was right here. "Sheriff," Iron Bill called out, his voice carrying over the morning wind. "I think we need to have a closer look at this barn, and maybe a chat with the kids." Leo backed away from the window, his heart hammering in his throat. He had to warn Claire. He had to get to the cellar. But as he turned toward the back door, a low, unnatural sound began to vibrate through the floorboards of the kitchen. At first, Leo thought it was an earthquake. The coffee cups on the counter began to rattle. The glass panes in the windows shook in their frames. Outside, Sheriff Boyd and Iron Bill froze. The bikers looked toward the main highway, their expressions shifting from predatory confidence to sudden, absolute dread. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the sound of engines. Not a dozen. Not 100. It was a massive, deafening, mechanical roar that seemed to swallow the entire valley. The ground physically trembled. Coming over the crest of the two-lane highway, blocking out the morning sun, was a tidal wave of chrome, leather, and black paint. They were riding four abreast, an endless, venomous snake of heavy motorcycles stretching as far as the eye could see. They wore the colors of the national charter. Nomads, enforcers, presidents, from California, Nevada, Washington, and beyond. Claire's message had been received, and 3,000 riders had just arrived to answer the call. The sheer volume of the sound was entirely unnatural, a physical force that pressed against the chest and rattled the teeth in your skull. It wasn't just a group of motorcycles, it was a mechanized cavalry, a rolling earthquake of polished chrome, heavy leather, and roaring V-twin engines. They flooded the two-lane rural highway, spilling over the shoulders and kicking up a massive, blinding cloud of yellow Oregon dust that blotted out the morning sun. Sheriff Tom Boyd, a man who had ruled Deschutes County with an iron fist and a badge he'd long since tarnished, physically shrank. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. He took his hand off his service weapon and took a slow, trembling step backward. 4 armed men and 1 corrupt cop against a tidal wave of 3,000 enraged outlaws. The math was not just bad, it was fatal. Iron Bill Lawson stood frozen near the edge of the woods. The piece of rusted chain fell from his numb fingers, landing softly in the mud. For the first time in his brutal, extortion-fueled life, Bill looked exactly like what he truly was, a cornered rat. The procession of motorcycles didn't rush the property. They executed a terrifyingly disciplined maneuver. Hundreds of riders broke off, forming a massive, impenetrable perimeter around the Hamilton farm, cutting off the driveway, the highway, and the timberline. They were locking the county down. No one was coming in, and absolutely no one was getting out. At the head of the pack, a group of about 20 riders killed their engines simultaneously. The sudden silence that followed was heavier and more intimidating than the roar had been. These weren't local street-level thugs. These were the elite, the nomads, the national officers from Oakland and San Bernardino, the men who upheld the old laws of the club, the violent, uncompromising codes set down decades ago by founders like Sonny Barger. They wore pristine white nomad bottom rockers on their leather cuts, signaling that they answered to no local president, only to the club itself. A man dismounted a heavily customized, blacked-out Harley Road King. He was a mountain of a human being, standing 6'4", with a thick silver beard and eyes like cracked granite. His cut bore the National Sergeant-at-Arms patch. His name was Oakland Ray Reynolds, and he was a legend within the underworld, a man who solved the club's most severe internal problems with absolute, brutal efficiency. But it was the man who stepped off the passenger seat of Ray's bike that made Iron Bill let out a choked, desperate gasp. It was Dutch Moretti. Dutch looked like he had walked through hell. His left arm was in a heavy sling. His ribs were tightly bound beneath a blood-spotted t-shirt. And the left side of his face was a mosaic of purple bruises and butterfly stitches from where Bill's men had run his motorcycle off the interstate. But he was breathing, and his eyes were locked onto Iron Bill with a murderous, unblinking intensity. "Bill," Oakland Ray said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly across the gravel driveway. It held no anger, only the cold, administrative finality of an executioner. "You've been busy." Iron Bill stammered, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Ray, Dutch, listen to me." Dutch went rogue. He was stealing from the charter. "I had to." "Save it," Dutch rasped, taking a slow, agonizing step forward. He didn't even look at the other local bikers, who were already backing away from Bill, hands raised in universal surrender. "Where is she, Bill? Where is my wife?" Sheriff Boyd, desperate to save his own skin, threw his hands up. "I don't know anything about a woman. Bill told me we were looking for a fugitive. I'm local law enforcement. You boys need to step back." Oakland Ray didn't even look at the sheriff. He just snapped his fingers. 4 massive nomads stepped forward, drew heavy 1,911 pistols, and racked the slides in terrifying unison. Boyd froze, swallowing his words, his badge suddenly feeling like a target pinned to his chest. "I left her in the woods," Bill lied, his voice cracking. "She's dead, Dutch. I'm sorry. It was business." From the front porch, 9-year-old Leo Hamilton couldn't take it anymore. He pushed past his father, Mark, who tried frantically to grab his son's shirt collar. "He's lying!" Leo screamed, his high-pitched voice cutting through the heavy tension like a knife. Every head in the yard snapped toward the little boy. Oakland Ray raised an eyebrow. Dutch Moretti stopped in his tracks. "Leo, get inside!" Mark yelled, terrified, pulling the boy behind him. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, he's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying." "Let the boy speak," Oakland Ray commanded. It wasn't a request. Leo stepped out from behind his father, his knees knocking together, but his jaw set with a stubborn, fierce courage. He pointed a shaking finger right at Iron Bill's chest. "He chained her to a tree to freeze to death. But she's not dead. I broke the chain." Dutch's good eye widened. "Where is she, kid?" "Follow me," Leo said. With 3,000 men watching in dead silence, the 9-year-old boy marched off the porch, leading the towering, battered biker and the National Sergeant-at-Arms around the side of the house. Mark Hamilton followed close behind, refusing to let his son out of his sight. They reached the old, overgrown storm cellar behind the barn. Leo grabbed the heavy iron ring and heaved the wooden door open. The musty smell of damp earth wafted up. "Claire!" Leo called down into the darkness. "It's me! It's Leo! You can come out now!" For a long, agonizing moment, there was no sound. Then, the slow shuffling of boots on the dirt stairs. When Claire emerged into the harsh morning light, she looked like a ghost. The heavy woolen hunting blanket was still draped over her trembling shoulders. Her face was battered, her wrists raw and bloody from the industrial chains. But when she looked up and saw Dutch standing there, the hardened, terrifying biker wife melted away. "Dutch," she sobbed, her knees giving out. Dutch caught her with his one good arm, pulling her against his chest, burying his face in her matted hair. The giant, terrifying outlaw squeezed his eyes shut, and for the first time, a single tear cut through the dirt and grease on his cheek. "I got you," Dutch whispered fiercely. "I got you, baby." Claire pulled back just enough to look over Dutch's shoulder. She saw Oakland Ray, and then her eyes found Iron Bill Lawson, who was being held to the ground by 2 massive enforcers in the driveway. Claire's sorrow vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating rage of a woman who had survived the devil's snare. She pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger directly at the corrupt chapter president. "He burned the books, Ray," Claire said, her voice echoing across the silent farm. "He was selling club guns to the cartels out of Portland and keeping the cash. And he bought Sheriff Boyd with our money. Oakland Ray nodded slowly. He looked down at the 9-year-old boy standing by the cellar door. You did this, kid? You got her out? Leo nodded, swallowing hard. I used my dad's bolt cutters. The yellow ones. Ray looked at Mark Hamilton, who was standing defensively behind his son. You raised a hell of a man, Mr. Hamilton. You have the club's deepest apologies for bringing this filth to your doorstep. It ends today. Ray turned on his heel and marched back toward the driveway, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The air in the yard shifted. The anticipation was over. The reckoning had begun. What happened next in the driveway of the Hamilton farm was a display of underworld justice, so swift and absolute that it would be whispered about in Deschutes County for decades. Oakland Ray stood over Iron Bill Lawson. Bill was on his knees in the dirt, sobbing, begging for his life, throwing out desperate promises of hidden cash and loyalty. Ray didn't say a word. He simply reached down and grabbed the collar of Bill's heavy leather cut, the sacred vest that bore the Hells Angels' Death Head logo. With a brutal, violent jerk, Ray ripped the vest right off Bill's shoulders. The sound of the thick leather tearing was sickeningly loud. William Lawson, Ray's voice boomed, completely devoid of emotion. You are stripped of your patch. You are out in bad standing. Your ink will be burned from your skin, and your name is dead to this club. To be excommunicated in bad standing meant you were no longer protected. You were prey. Every rival gang, every cartel, and every outlaw who wanted to make a name for themselves now knew there was a green light on Bill's head. Ray tossed the torn vest to one of the nomads. Put him in the van. We'll take him for a ride to the desert. He's going to explain his accounting discrepancies to the national treasurer. Two massive bikers dragged us screaming, thrashing Iron Bill toward an unmarked black cargo van. The doors slammed shut, cutting off his cries instantly. Sheriff Tom Boyd watched this happen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slowly began to inch his way toward his police cruiser, hoping the bikers were too focused on their internal politics to care about a corrupt local cop. Sheriff, Dutch Moretti's voice rang out. Boyd froze. Dutch walked slowly toward him, his good hand resting on the heavy hunting knife strapped to his belt. You're a disgrace to that badge, Dutch spat, stopping inches from the trembling sheriff. But the club doesn't kill cops. It brings heat we don't need. Boyd let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. Thank you. I swear, I didn't know. Shut up, Dutch growled. He pulled a manila envelope from his back pocket and tossed it onto the hood of the police cruiser. That's every bank record, wire transfer, and offshore account Iron Bill set up in your name. We had our hackers pull it last night. The FBI field office in Portland received the exact same envelope 20 minutes ago, along with an anonymous tip about a corrupt sheriff aiding in an attempted murder. In the distance, over the roaring idle of the motorcycles, the faint, high-pitched wail of federal sirens began to echo through the valley. They weren't local sirens. They were black SUVs tearing down the highway. The National Club had orchestrated a masterful cleanup. They handled their own traitor internally, and they handed the corrupt cop to the feds on a silver platter, keeping their own hands legally clean. Boyd collapsed against his cruiser, sliding down to the dirt, burying his face in his hands as his entire life evaporated into thin air. Before the FBI convoy could breach the perimeter, Oakland Ray gave a sharp, two-finger whistle. The 3,000 bikers began to mount their machines. The operation was over. It was time to vanish back into the wind. But Dutch Moretti didn't get on his bike immediately. He and Claire walked slowly back to the porch, where Leo and his father were still standing in stunned silence. Dutch dropped down onto one knee, ignoring the agonizing pain in his broken ribs, so he was eye level with the 9-year-old boy. Up close, the biker was terrifying, covered in scars, tattoos, and fresh blood. But his eyes were incredibly soft. Leo, Dutch said, his voice thick with emotion, you saved my wife's life. You went into the dark when you didn't have to. You risked your own life to save a stranger. Dutch reached into his vest and pulled out something heavy. He took Leo's small hand and pressed the object into his palm, closing the boy's fingers around it. Leo opened his hand. It was a heavy, solid gold challenge coin, stamped with the unmistakable winged death head and the words Deus ex machina, God from the machine, It was a president's token, an incredibly rare artifact within the club. "You hold on to that, kid," Dutch said, looking deeply into Leo's eyes. "My wife told you that you'd have an army behind you for the rest of your life." She wasn't lying. You ever find yourself in trouble? You ever need a favor? Or if anybody ever tries to lay a hand on you or your family, you show that coin to any man flying our colors. They will burn the world down to keep you safe. You are under the protection of the National Charter. Forever. Claire leaned down, tears streaming down her bruised face, and kissed Leo gently on the forehead. "Thank you, my brave little lion. Thank you." With a final nod to Mark Hamilton, Dutch and Claire walked back to Oakland Ray's bike. Claire climbed onto the back, wrapping her arms tightly around her husband. Ray kicked the massive Harley into gear. The sound triggered a chain reaction. 3,000 engines roared to life simultaneously, shaking the leaves from the oak trees and rattling the windows of the farmhouse. In a perfectly synchronized, thundering formation, the endless sea of bikers pulled out of the driveway and onto the highway, riding back. Within minutes, the dust settled. The deafening roar faded into a low, distant hum, and then silence. The deep, isolated quiet of the Oregon timberlands returned. Except for the sirens, the FBI SUVs swarmed the property, agents pouring out with assault rifles drawn, only to find Sheriff Tom Boyd sitting in the dirt, weeping, waiting to be handcuffed. Years passed. The story of the day, 3,000 Hells Angels descended on Deschutes County, became a local myth, a campfire tale, told to scare kids away from the deep woods. The federal investigation completely gutted the local police department, sweeping out the corruption and sending Boyd to a federal penitentiary for 2 decades. The local chapter of the motorcycle club was disbanded, their clubhouse seized by the state. But for Leo Hamilton, the story wasn't a myth. It was a quiet, defining reality. As he grew older, strange things would happen. When his father's mechanic shop fell on hard times during a recession, an anonymous cashier's check arrived in the mail, exactly covering their debts. When a group of older teenagers tried to jump Leo behind the high school bleachers when he was 15, 2 massive, heavily tattooed men in unmarked leather vests seemingly appeared out of thin air, politely but terrifyingly advising the bullies to walk away and never look at Leo again. Leo went on to college, became a structural engineer, and eventually started a family of his own. He lived a quiet, lawful, and peaceful life. But he never forgot the cold October night he walked into the pines. And he never forgot the promise made to him by a battered woman in the mud. He kept the gold challenge coin locked in a small velvet box on his desk. It was a constant reminder that the world is a dangerous, unpredictable place, filled with monsters and corrupt men. But it was also a reminder that sometimes, the most profound acts of loyalty and justice don't come from a badge or a courtroom. Sometimes, they come from the roaring engines of the criminal underworld, bound by an ancient code of honor, rising up to repay a debt to a 9-year-old boy who simply refused to let a stranger die in the dark. What a truly unbelievable testament to the power of a single act of bravery. Leo Hamilton was just a kid, but his choice to step into the dark and help Claire Moretti sparked a chain reaction that took down a corrupt empire and brought an army of 3,000 riders right to his front door. It proves that courage doesn't have an age requirement, and sometimes the strongest protection comes from the most unexpected places in the world. If this incredible true story of loyalty, betrayal, and underworld justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with your friends to spread this insane tale. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on more mind-blowing, real-life stories like this one. See you in the next video.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, little boy stumbled on a Hell's Angel wife chained to a tree. What he did next shocked 3,000 riders. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the reminder that courage and kindness can sometimes come from the people we least expect. Stories like this often make us think about how a single decision made in a difficult moment can have a lasting impact on others. It's a simple idea, but one that feels meaningful no matter where we come from. Have you ever witnessed someone step up and do the right thing when nobody expected it? And what part of these stories stood out to you the most? I'd love to hear your perspective and how you interpreted the events that unfolded. Maybe the lesson here is to pay attention when someone needs help and not assume that small actions don't matter. Even a simple choice to care, listen, or act can make a difference in someone's day. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us. If this story gave you something to think about, feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, a like or subscription is always appreciated.